Welcome back, February 4th, 2021. It keeps coming up. What is a conservative anyway? What is conservatism? William Bennett and John Cribb write, if you are a young person just beginning to pay attention to current affairs and politics, there are a couple things you should know. The first is that nearly 40% of Americans consider themselves conservatives. The second thing you should know is that despite their numbers, conservatives sometimes face questions and even sneering remarks about what values they stand for. Portions of the culture tend to depict conservatism as backwards and wrong-headed. They may try to convince you that conservatives are mean-spirited, greedy, or prejudiced people. Most of the national mainstream media news organizations have a strong liberal left bias. That includes everything from ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and NPR. It also includes influential papers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Hollywood, likewise, is a famously liberal place, and many of the television programs and movies it produces have the same bias. They carry messages that belittle the values and attack the institutions many Americans respect. Messages like family is down market, religious people are nuts, and businessmen don't care about poor people or the environment. College campuses may be the most anti-conservative places in the country. Liberal professors dominate most faculties. At many universities, conservative ideas are shouted down or cut off. Quote, instructors feel free to mock conservatives in the classroom, and administrators pay scant attention when their posters are torn down or their sensibilities offended, close quote, writes a rare conservative Ivy League professor, Ruth Weiss. Liberal politicians routinely paint conservatives as mean-spirited extremists. President Barack Obama, for example, who is probably, until Joe Biden, the most liberal president in history, told Republicans in Congress, quote, stop just hating all the time, close quote. In short, several of America's elite institutions give out anti-conservative messages, some subtle, some not so. The bearers of those messages aren't interested in helping anyone understand conservative principles. They're interested in smearing those principles, and if you are a conservative, then maybe smearing you too. And this, by the way, includes professional athletics. The term conservative comes from the Latin word conservare, which means to keep safe, maintain, preserve. Conservatives want to preserve society's best values and wisdom. The values that conservatives strive to maintain aren't new. Most have been around for a long time, passed down from generation to generation because they make life worth the living. Values like love your neighbor as yourself and honesty is the best policy. Virtues such as self-discipline, generosity, gratitude. When we forget or neglect these things, individual lives unravel, and civilizations can even come apart. When conservatives step back and look at the world, when they study human activity and history, they see a pattern. The pattern is a set of truths that run through all of time, principles about how best to live and treat our fellow human beings. These principles aren't truths that each person invents for himself or herself. They are universal standards of right and wrong, or laws of nature and nature's God, as the founders of the United States put it in the Declaration of Independence. They were in operation before you were born and will be around long after you die. The Ten Commandments, found in the biblical books of Exodus and Deuteronomy, are some of the greatest and most famous examples of such timeless moral laws. No better code of conduct has ever been written. When people follow principles like thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not bear false witness, their lives tend to be fulfilling, meaningful, and good. When they break them, bad things generally happen. Conservatives recognize that enduring moral truths exist, and they are concerned with preserving ways that help us all live up to them. But conservatives don't claim to be morally superior to everyone else. Like everyone else, they are imperfect creatures. They also realize that the world is complicated, that applying principles to life requires judgment, prudence, and that sometimes there are exceptions to rules. For example, killing is generally wrong, but sometimes killing can be necessary. Self-defense, war. Conservatives take history seriously. They know there is much to be learned from the long record of human experience. It reveals both the possibilities and limitations of human nature. History contains much inhumanity and misery, to be sure, yet an honest reading shows that despite some great blots, the achievement of Western civilization in the United States in particular stands higher than the rest. None of this means conservatives want to save everything old. Sometimes old ideas, such as ancient prejudices, need to be rejected. Values are worth protecting only if they do good. Preserving society's best values and wisdom lies at the heart of conservatism, but there's more to it than that. In America, being conservative involves a commitment to the principles upon which this country was founded. Ideals found in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and other writings. Ideals such as that all people are created equal and all have the right to think and speak freely. Religious freedom. Conservatives believe that these founding principles have made the United States a powerful force for good, not only for their own citizens, but to the world. Although there is no neat and tidy list of American conservative beliefs, there are several ideas that conservatives tend to agree with. One handy way to remember those ideas is the acronym FLINT, which corresponds to the 5 concepts of free enterprise, limited government, individual liberty, national defense, traditional values. These 5 concepts are critical for understanding American conservative thought. George Nash, who wrote the great book The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America, wrote this. In 1945, no articulate, coordinated conservative intellectual force existed in the United States. There were at the most scattered voices of protest, profoundly pessimistic about the future of their country, and convinced that they were a forlorn, isolated remnant standing athwart history yelling stop. Gradually, during the first post-war decade, these voices multiplied, acquired an audience, and began to generate an intellectual movement. In the beginning, there was not one right-wing renaissance, but 3, each reacting in diverse ways to challenges from the left. The first of these groupings consisted of libertarians and classical liberals, resisting the threat of the ever-expanding state to individual liberty, free market capitalism, and individual initiative. Convinced in the 1940s that America was rapidly drifting toward expanded state planning and socialism, toward what Friedrich Hayek called the road to serfdom, these intellectuals offered a powerful defense of free market economics that achieved some influence by the 1950s, and it became more and more prominent over the years. And the Reagan administration's policies of tax rate cutting, deregulation, and the encouragement of private sector economic growth are the direct product of that rich intellectual history. Concurrently and independently of the libertarians, a second school of new thought emerged in America in the first post-war decade, the New Conservatism, also known as traditionalism. Men such as Robert Nisbet and Russell Kirk represented this. Shocked by totalitarianism, total war, and the development of secular rootless mass society during the 1930s and 40s, these conservatives urged a return to traditional religious and ethical absolutes and a rejection of the moral relativism which had allegedly corroded Western values and produced an intolerable vacuum filled by demonic ideologies and pseudo-religions. More generally European-oriented and historically minded than the classical liberals, the traditional conservatives extolled the wisdom of European thinkers like Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville, and called for a revival of Christian orthodoxy and classical natural law, pre-modern political philosophy, and mediating institutions between the citizen and the state. Third, there appeared in the 1940s and 1950s a more militant or evangelistic anti-communism, shaped decisively by a number of ex-communists of the 1930s, including Whittaker Chambers and Frank Meyer, James Burnham, many more. It was also reinforced by a number of articulate anti-communist exiled scholars from Eastern and Central Europe. These former men of the left and their European emigre allies brought to the post-war right a profound conviction that the West was engaged in a titanic struggle with an implacable adversary, communism, that sought nothing less than the conquest of the world. Each of these emerging components of the conservative revival shared a deep antipathy to 20th century liberalism. To the libertarians, modern liberalism was the ideology of the ever-aggrandizing bureaucratic welfare state, which would, if unchecked, become the totalitarian state, destroying individual liberty and private property. To the traditionalists, liberalism was a disintegrative philosophy, which, like acid, was eating away at the ethical and institutional foundations of traditional society, thereby creating a vast spiritual vacuum into which totalitarianism could enter. To the Cold War anti-communists, modern liberalism, relativistic, secular, anti-traditional, socialist, was by its very nature incapable of vigorously resisting an enemy on its left. Liberalism to them was part of the left and could not effectively repulse a foe with which it shared so many underlying assumptions. As James Burnham would put it, liberalism was essentially a means for reconciling the West to its own destruction. Liberalism was the ideology of Western suicide. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, these three independent wings of the conservative revolt against the left began to coalesce. The movement found its first popular embodiment in the editor of National Review, William Buckley, who, apart from his great talents, personified each impulse in the developing coalition. He was at once a Roman Catholic traditionalist, a defender of the free market libertarian, and a staunch anti-communist. Then came two other schools, Straussians and neoconservatives. They are lumped together often, usually by the left, but they are very different. They are also, to me, the most interesting. Straussians, led by the refugee Leo Strauss, revived classical political philosophy from the likes of Aristotle and Plato and merged it with the best of Judeo-Christian ethics, forming what is known as the axis of Athens and Jerusalem. From Leo Strauss, you get his most famous of students like Alan Bloom and Harry Jaffa, Walter Burns, and Hadley Arkes. Then you have, starting in the late 1960s, neoconservatism. It was not about foreign or defense policy, as so many say it is now. It was a group of disaffected liberals who saw the wreckage of the Great Society on domestic issues like crime, family, welfare, and applied rigorous social science to prove and show such wreckage. Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, James Q. Wilson, William Bennett, Michael Novak were some of the most famous ones in this group. Sometimes people put Daniel Patrick Moynihan in there before he returned to liberalism in that group as well. As for me, I side ultimately with my teacher, Harry V. Jaffa, who put it this way, quote, "It would certainly seem that the salvation of the West must come, if it is to come, from the United States. The salvation of the United States, if it is to come, must come from the Republican Party. And the salvation of the Republican Party, if it is to come, must come from the conservative movement within it. And the salvation of the conservative movement, if it is to come, must come from the renewal and reaffirmation of the principles of the American founding, embodied above all in the Declaration of Independence, such a reaffirmation as happened in the events that led to the election of Abraham Lincoln." Close quote. That, to me, is conservatism. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.